So it seems like at least once a year, this popular discussion arises over what race the ancient Egyptians were, or perhaps more accurately, what skin color they were. Most people seem to be able to comprehend the fact that ancient Egypt, in the ancient world and in the modern world, is a land bridge between people living in the Near East and people living in Saharan Africa. So over thousands of years, you have people with orange skin meeting people with darker brown skin. And what do they produce? Well, they produce children with skin colors varying from each side of the scale. Every so often you have distant traders from the greater Mediterranean arriving by boat and deciding to stay, making the pool of skin colors marginally paler in some areas of Egypt. Most people can comprehend this. But another popular argument is that the ancient Egyptians must have been an entirely dark-skinned civilization, which isn't even supported by the statuary work seen in the Old Kingdom where rulers have this burnt orange skin color. And then something really bizarre I saw last week was someone claiming that the Egyptians could have been white.
Oh my God, bro.
Oh, hell no, man. What the man?
Anyway, I think it's time to set the record straight on who the ancient Egyptians were, where they came from, and how many times their racial composition changed during their ancient history. And at the end of this video, I think that you'll have a pretty good understanding of how vast, diverse, and complicated ancient Egypt's history really is. So we have evidence of people living in Egypt as far back as 1 million years ago. This vast era marks what we call the Paleolithic period, spanning from around 1 million years ago to around 7,000 years ago, or 5000 BC. During this long period, sites like el Ka'ab, Nag Ahmed, Bar el Ha'ar, the Dakhla Oasis, and the Fayum were inhabited primarily by Homo erectus and early Homo sapiens, who were arriving in Egypt and attempting to adapt and overcome specific challenges of surviving in this environment. Now, this was many thousands of years before the pharaohs. And these Egyptians lived a vastly different life than what we imagine life in ancient Egypt to have been like. While they did mostly live along the Nile River, these were semi-nomadic people, hunter-gatherer groups who seemed to have never settled in one spot for too long, although multiple waves of hunter-gatherers separated by thousands of years seem to have chosen many of the same locations to settle down, at least temporarily. As far as we know, these people didn't build shelters substantially enough to survive tens or hundreds of thousands of years later. If they weren't living in huts, they may have had local caves to take refuge in. And in fact, in 1933, the Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almasi discovered a Paleolithic site in the farthest reaching western deserts of Egypt. Now, this site, known as the Cave of Swimmers, dates back about 10,000 years. And is famous for its cave art depicting figures with their legs bent and stretched out as if they were swimming. Now, why is there a depiction of people swimming deep inside of a cave hidden in the middle of the Sahara Desert? And furthermore, there are also depictions of a giraffe and a hippopotamus. Well, it's actually archaeological evidence like this that indicates a much greener and more tropical Sahara must have existed sometime around 10,000 years ago. Even though the green Sahara would have been a much more inviting environment to live in as compared to the Sahara today, the intense ultraviolet radiation from the North African sun would have caused these Saharan ancestors to evolve a much darker skin color to protect them from the sun. Although as you go further back in time, their facial features would have looked increasingly different from our own. Their skin color would have been what we call today black. At this same time, though, we can't ignore the populations who were also developing in the Near East, Turkey, and Greece, all having evidence of habitation dating back at least some 200,000 years. These people would eventually come to meet these Paleolithic Egyptians, if they hadn't already, as trade routes and the ease by which human beings had the ability to travel began to rapidly increase. Around 10,000 years ago, something catastrophic was beginning to happen in the Sahara. All of the fertile land that the newly sedentary farmers were beginning to raise cattle on was drying up. The rivers were running dry and the ground became unable to bear the limited plants that ancient farmers were learning to grow. With increasingly limited options, these ancient Saharans had only three choices to make. They were probably familiar with trading caravans that arrived every so often from the northern coastline. They also must have known there were more people living farther to the south in what we would call today the Congo or the Savannah. But they may have also heard of this river valley out to the east where displaced Saharans were finding a lush, tropical, fertile strip of land that existed along a huge freshwater river, perfect for continuing the kind of life they were starting to build for themselves. This gradual migration out of the Sahara into the Nile Valley continued until around 4000 BC, when various tribes and chiefdoms began to spring up across the Nile. These cultures produced pottery that we can see today, depicting daily life, animals, and even river boats with flags and sails on them. Over the next millennium, these various chiefdoms would eventually merge into two separate regions: the Upper Kingdom in the south and the Lower Kingdom in the north. We don't know what these kingdoms were called, but we refer to this period as the Two Lands. While these were two distinct kingdoms, from the archaeological evidence we can infer they were almost entirely of the same genetic makeup, as well as following largely the same religious practices and gods. And this period ends around 3150 BC, with a king in the south known as Narmer marching his way north and smiting the ruler of the opposing kingdom, thus unifying the two lands. From here, the pharaoh would become known as the ruler of the two lands, and the image of this unification, the tying of the lotus and papyrus flower, would be depicted on pharaohs' thrones for the next 3,000 years.